Hi, welcome to episode 8. We're looking at pathologies here that result when there's an imbalance in the mesh. Now, every organization has its official name for dysfunction. Phrases like misalignment, scope creep, low morale, technical debt, velocity drop, or poor communication. But beneath these labels lie deeper behavioral patterns that almost always tell a more truthful story. These patterns don't arrive suddenly, they accumulate. A little avoidance here, a little overconfidence here, a week of unclear decisions, a month of overcommitment, slow erosion of trust, and eventually the team finds itself struggling, not because something catastrophic has happened, but because those small imbalances have hardened into something quite structural. These recurring behaviors, the ones that show up across industries, across methodologies, across roles and personalities, these are called pathologies. Not in the medical sense, but in the systemic sense. Predictable responses that emerge when the mesh is distorted, when one ring tries to compensate for another which has fallen away. And what makes these patterns dangerous is not their intensity, but their subtlety. They rarely come with announcement, they drift in quietly, wearing the same mask of professionalism or disguise of just how things are. By the time anyone names them, the behavior is normalized. So today we're going to explore the psychology of these pathologies, not to shame teams, but in order to understand teams, because understanding is the first step to repairing. One of the most seductive patterns is the pathology of over-adaptation, where teams become so responsive that their responsiveness itself becomes a threat to their coherence. At first, this looks at agility at its best, the ability to absorb changes, pivot quickly, satisfy every request, keep everyone happy. But beneath the surface, the team is dissolving, their identity is blurring, their boundaries are weakening, because every new piece of information feels urgent. Their sense of stability has faded. I once coached a team that prided itself on its ability to handle last-minute changes with enthusiasm. But the truth revealed itself over time. They weren't adapting, they were surrendering. They had no earth to anchor them, so water swallowed everything. They flowed in every direction except the one that moved the work forward. So, over-adaptation is not flexibility, it's fear in disguise, a fear of disappointing stakeholders, a fear of being seen as inflexible, a fear of establishing boundaries. And fear is really a terrible operating system for delivery. Then there's a pattern of false urgency which spreads through organizations that have weak void. In these environments, everything is labeled critical, whether or not it actually is. Teams begin to equate activity with success, mistaking busyness for progress. Conversations really become driven by deadlines rather than outcomes. People rush without understanding, and the rush eventually becomes a culture. Now, the danger of false urgency is that it erodes judgment. It forces teams into a perpetual sprint, not the healthy cadence of agile, but a psychological sprint where no one stops long enough to really think. When the void disappears, fire burns without oxygen, and that always leads to exhaustion. False urgency rarely originates within a team. It begins with that leadership who themselves are overwhelmed and pressured and afraid to pause. But teams internalize that pressure so deeply that eventually they don't know how to operate without it. Stillness becomes suspicious. Reflection becomes indulgent, and wisdom, which requires space, disappears. Then there's a pathology of learned helplessness. This is another pattern I've seen across teams who've lived too long inside environments where fire and earth are both weak. Learned helplessness. It appears when the team has repeatedly tried to influence decisions, set boundaries, raise concerns, and find themselves ignored, overridden, or sidelined. Eventually, they just stop trying. The retrospectives become quieter, the stand-ups become quite mechanical, and people just stop offering ideas because they no longer believe that ideas will change anything. This pathology is really dangerous because it masquerades as compliance. To an untrained eye, the team looks calm, agreeable, low drama, and easy to manage. But beneath that calm is resignation, and beneath that resignation is the death of creativity. A team in learned helplessness isn't lazy, they're depleted. Once the team stops expecting their voice to matter, delivery becomes a lot harder. Repairing this pathology requires more than process tweaks. It requires restoring the team's dignity and agency, reminding people through action rather than words that their perspective will make a difference. Next is the pathology of silent dissent. There's no pathology more widespread than the silent dissent. This is the moment where disagreements stop being spoken out loud and become internalized. It begins gently enough. A decision is made that someone disagrees with, but instead of challenging it, they nod politely and move on. Not because they agree, but because disagreement feels a bit tiring and a bit risky. The next time it happens, they stay silent again, and as does somebody else. And slowly the team start to build this facade of alignment that collapses with the slightest pressure. Deadlines slip, commitments fracture, and the surprise emerges later. Not because people are incompetent, because the truth has gone underground. Win cannot function in environments where dissent is punished or ignored. And when the wind fades, the mesh becomes opaque. Leaders make decisions in the dark, teams deliver work they never really believed in, and tension builds silently until it actually becomes a force of its own. The tragedy of silent dissent is that teams could have prevented failure altogether, but the moment for honesty passed months ago, disguised as politeness. Next is the pathology of invisible blockers. This emerges when teams are so accustomed to being overloaded or rushed that they stop escalating barriers. They simply absorb the obstruction, assuming it's normal, assuming that nothing can be done, assuming that nobody has time to hear it anyway. Blockers hide inside technical complexities, inside ambiguous responsibilities, inside dependencies that stretch across three teams. What makes this pathology dangerous is that invisible blockers don't look like obstacles, they look like delays. And delays get misdiagnosed as performance issues rather than systemic issues. The team isn't slow, the path is obstructed, but when people are too overwhelmed to describe the obstruction, the system interprets the slowness as a fault of the team. This is where leaders with strong wind can save months of pain by noticing the subtle tints that the team has normalized. Next is the pathology of constant rework. Constant rework is often a signal of a distortion of fire and wind, when decisions are made quickly but without awareness and the team moves confidently in the right direction. They build the wrong things amazingly well, but sadly they eventually discover that the work needs to be reframed, reinterpreted, rebuilt. And rework in small doses is part of the job, but rework as a pattern, rework that repeats across sprints, across features, across teams, is a sign that the mesh is not guiding decisions with enough intelligence. Something is being missed, and the organization is paying for that blindness through wasted effort. And teams, as a result of this, start to doubt their own judgment, when in reality the issue lies with the decision-making environment and not the individual. Then we have the pathology of rigidity. A pathology that emerges when the earth becomes so overemphasized that water disappears. You see this in teams who cling to their processes with religious devotion, who treat ceremonies as ends rather than tools, who resist change, not because change is harmful, but because stability has become the only defense against uncertainty. Rigid teams are slow to adapt, not because they lack talent, but because their identity has become entangled with their structure. They confuse predictability with stability and mistake reliability for immutability. And what happens is the world moves around them and they remain stuck. And not only won't they change, but they've actually forgotten how to change. So this was a range of pathologies that emerged as a result of the mesh breaking down. Understanding these patterns, it's not about labeling teams or diagnosing flaws. It's all about being able to see the mesh with more precision. These pathologies are shadows that show you where to look. They reveal which ring is calling out for support. They expose subtle imbalances that can't be corrected by more processes or more tools, or certainly not more meetings. The pathologies tell you where to heal. Once you can see them clearly, you can stop reacting to symptoms and start addressing the deeper issues. Restore earth where stability is cracked. Strengthen water where adaptation has become frantic. Rekindle fire where courage has faded. Refine wind where perception is dulled. And reclaim the void when stillness has vanished. Now that we've explored these pathologies, these shadows that are cast when the mesh weakens, the next episode will look at how decisions actually travel through a team and why some decisions create clarity while others create chaos, and how the rings can help shape the decision-making process. And this is where everything you've learned so far becomes practical. Decision routing as a leadership art. Thanks for listening. Hit like, hit subscribe, and see you in episode 9.